Get ready to embark on a tranquil journey through enchanting narratives. Welcome to a world of soothing dreams. Welcome to Bithic's Bedtime Stories. Bithic's Bedtime Stories invites you to immerse yourself in our podcast with our exclusive 15-ounce ceramic mug, a masterpiece of design. It not only captivates with its visual charm, but also adds a touch of practicality to your relaxation routine. Microwave your favorite beverage to perfection and let every sip become a moment of pure bliss. And that's not all. Step into sustainable style with our unisex District Re-Tea. This tea isn't just recycled, it's reincarnated with 100% recycled fabric, and it proudly features artwork from our podcast. Feel the karma as you flaunt a sea-free product where every material and production method dances a carbon-neutral jig, leaving only good vibes in its wake. Escape, sip, and style with Bithic's Bedtime Stories, where every moment is a journey into serenity. The Egg by Sherwood Anderson. My father was, I am sure, intended by nature to be a cheerful, kindly man. Until he was 34 years old, he worked as a farmhand for a man named Thomas Butterworth, whose place lay near the town of Bidwell, Ohio. He had then a horse of his own, and on Saturday evenings drove into town to spend a few hours in social intercourse with other farmhands. In town, he drank several glasses of beer and stood about in Ben Head's saloon, crowded on Saturday evenings with visiting farmhands. Songs were sung and glasses thumped on the bar. At 10 o'clock, Father drove home along a lonely country road, made his horse comfortable for the night, and himself went to bed, quite happy in his position in life. He had at that time no notion of trying to rise in the world. It was in the spring of his 35th year that Father married my mother, then a country school teacher, and in the following spring I came wriggling and crying into the world. Something happened to the two people. They became ambitious. The American passion for getting up in the world took possession of them. It may have been that Mother was responsible. Being a school teacher, she had no doubt read books and magazines. She had, I presume, read of how Garfield, Lincoln, and other Americans rose from poverty to fame and greatness, and as I lay beside her, in the days of her lying in, she may have dreamed that I would someday rule men and cities. At any rate, she induced Father to give up his place as a farmhand, sell his horse, and embark on an independent enterprise of his own. She was a tall, silent woman with a long nose and troubled gray eyes. For herself, she wanted nothing. For Father and myself, she was incurably ambitious. The first venture into which the two people went turned out badly. They rented 10 acres of poor, stony land on Griggs Road, 8 miles from Bidwell, and launched into chicken raising. I grew into boyhood on the place and got my first impressions of life there. From the beginning, there were impressions of disaster, and if, in my turn, I am a gloomy man inclined to see the darker side of life, I attribute it to the fact that what should have been for me the happy, joyous days of childhood were spent on the chicken farm. One unversed in such matters can have no notion of the many and tragic things that can happen to a chicken. It is born out of an egg, lives for a few weeks as a tiny, fluffy thing, such as you will see pictured on Easter cards, then becomes hideously naked eats quantities of corn and meal bought by the sweat of your father's brow, gets diseases called pip, cholera, and other names, stands looking with stupid eyes at the sun, becomes sick, and dies. A few hens, now and then a rooster, intended to serve God's mysterious ends, struggle through to maturity. The hens lay eggs out of which come other chickens, and the dreadful cycle is thus made complete. It is all unbelievably complex. Most philosophers must have been raised on chicken farms. One hopes for so much from a chicken and is so dreadfully disillusioned. Small chickens, just setting out on the journey of life, look so bright and alert, and they are in fact so dreadfully stupid. They are so much like people they mix one up in one's judgments of life. If disease does not kill them, they wait until your expectations are thoroughly aroused, and then walk under the wheels of a wagon, to go squashed and dead back to their maker. Vermin infest their youth, and fortunes must be spent for curative powders. In later life, I have seen how a literature has been built up on the subject of fortunes to be made out of the raising of chickens. It is intended to be read by the gods who have just eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It is a hopeful literature, and declares that much may be done by simple, ambitious people who own a few hens. Do not be led astray by it. It was not written for you. Go hunt for gold on the frozen hills of Alaska. Put your faith in the honesty of politicians. Believe, if you will, that the world is daily growing better and that good will triumph over evil. But do not read and believe the literature that is written concerning the hen. It was not written for you. I, however, digress. My tale does not primarily concern itself with the hen. If correctly told, it will center on the egg. For 10 years, my father and mother struggled to make our chicken farm pay, and then they gave up that struggle and began another. They moved into the town of Bidwell, Ohio, and embarked in the restaurant business. After 10 years of worry with incubators that did not hatch, and with tiny, and in their own way lovely, balls of fluff that passed into a semi-naked pullethood, and from that into dead henhood, we threw all aside and, packing our belongings on a wagon, drove down Griggs Road toward Bidwell, a tiny caravan of hope, looking for a new place from which to start on our upward journey through life. We must have been a sad-looking lot, not, I fancy, unlike refugees fleeing from a battlefield. Mother and I walked in the road. The wagon that contained our goods had been borrowed for the day from Mr. Albert Griggs, a neighbor. Out of its sides stuck the legs of cheap chairs, and at the back of the pile of beds, tables, and boxes filled with kitchen utensils was a crate of live chickens, and on top of that the baby carriage in which I had been wheeled about in my infancy. Why we stuck to the baby carriage, I don't know. It was unlikely other children would be born, and the wheels were broken. People who have few possessions cling tightly to those they have. That is one of the facts that make life so discouraging. Father rode on top of the wagon. He was then a bald-headed man of 45, a little fat, and from long association with Mother and the chickens, he had become habitually silent and discouraged. All during our 10 years on the chicken farm, he had worked as a laborer on neighboring farms, and most of the money he had earned had been spent for remedies to cure chicken diseases, on Wilmer's White Wonder Cholera Cure, or Professor Bidlow's Egg Producer, or some other preparation that Mother found advertised in the poultry papers. There were 2 little patches of hair on Father's head just above his ears. I remember that as a child I used to sit looking at him when he had gone to sleep in a chair before the stove on Sunday afternoons in the winter. I had at that time already begun to read books and have notions of my own, and the bald path that led over the top of his head was, I fancied, something like a broad road, such a road as Caesar might have made on which to lead his legions out of Rome and into the wonders of an unknown world. The tufts of hair that grew above Father's ears were, I thought, like forests. I fell into a half-sleeping, half-waking state and dreamed I was a tiny thing going along the road into a far beautiful place where there were no chicken farms and where life was a happy, eggless affair. One might write a book concerning our flight from the chicken farm into town. Mother and I walked the entire 8 miles, she to be sure that nothing fell from the wagon, and I to see the wonders of the world. On the seat of the wagon beside Father was his greatest treasure. I will tell you of that. On a chicken farm where hundreds and even thousands of chickens come out of eggs, surprising things sometimes happen. Grotesques are born out of eggs as out of people. The accident does not often occur, perhaps once in 1,000 births. A chicken is, you see, born that has 4 legs, 2 pairs of wings, 2 heads, or what not. The things do not live. They go quickly back to the hand of their maker that has for a moment trembled. The fact that the poor little things could not live was one of the tragedies of life to Father. He had some sort of notion that if he could but bring into henhood or roosterhood a 5-legged hen or a 2-headed rooster, his fortune would be made. He dreamed of taking the wonder about to county fairs and of growing rich by exhibiting it to the other farm hands. At any rate, he saved all the monstrous things that had been born on our chicken farm. They were preserved in alcohol and put each in its own glass bottle. These he had carefully put into a box, and on our journey into town, it was carried on the wagon seat beside him. He drove the horses with one hand, and with the other clung to the box. When we got to our destination, the box was taken down at once, and the bottles removed. All during our days as keepers of a restaurant in the town of Bidwell, Ohio, the grotesques in their little glass bottles sat on a shelf back of the counter. Mother sometimes protested, but Father was a rock on the subject of his treasure. The grotesques were, he declared, valuable. People, he said, liked to look at strange and wonderful things. Did I say that we embarked in the restaurant business in the town of Bidwell, Ohio? I exaggerated a little. The town itself lay at the foot of a low hill and on the shore of a small river. The railroad did not run through the town, and the station was a mile away to the north at a place called Pickleville. There had been a cider mill and pickle factory at the station, but before the time of our coming, they had both gone out of business. In the morning and in the evening, buses came down to the station along a road called Turner's Pike from the hotel on the main street of Bidwell. Our going to the out-of-the-way place to embark in the restaurant business was Mother's idea. She talked of it for a year, and then one day went off and rented an empty store building opposite the rail station. It was her idea that the restaurant would be profitable. Traveling men, she said, would be always waiting around to take trains out of town, and town people would come to the station to await incoming trains. They would come to the restaurant to buy pieces of pie and drink coffee. Now that I am older, I know that she had another motive in going. She was ambitious for me. She wanted me to rise in the world, to get into a town school and become a man of the towns. At Pickleville, Father and Mother worked hard as they always had done. At first, there was the necessity of putting our place into shape to be a restaurant. That took a month. Father built a sign on which he put tins of vegetables. He painted a sign on which he put his name in large letters. Below his name was the sharp command, "Eat here," that was so seldom obeyed. A showcase was bought and filled with cigars and tobacco. Mother scrubbed the floor and the walls of the room. I went to school in the town and was glad to be away from the farm and from the presence of the discouraged, sad-looking chickens. Still, I was not very joyous. In the evening, I walked home from school along Turner's Pike and remembered the children I had seen playing in the town schoolyard. A troop of little girls had gone hopping about and singing. I tried that. Down along the frozen road I went, hopping solemnly on one leg. "Hippity-hop to the barber shop," I sang shrilly. Then I stopped and looked doubtfully about. I was afraid of being seen in my gay mood. It must have seemed to me that I was doing a thing that should not be done by one who, like myself, had been raised on a chicken farm where death was a daily visitor. Mother decided that our restaurant should remain open at night. At 10 in the evening, a passenger train went north past our door, followed by a local freight. The freight crew had switching to do in Pickleville, and when the work was done, they came to our restaurant for hot coffee and food. Sometimes one of them ordered a fried egg. In the morning at 4, they returned northbound and again visited us. A little trade began to grow up. My mother slept at night and during the day tended the restaurant and fed our boarders while Father slept. He slept in the same bed Mother had occupied during the night, and I went off to the town of Bidwell and to school. During the long nights, while Mother and I slept, Father cooked meats that were to go into sandwiches for the lunch baskets of our boarders. Then an idea in regard to getting up in the world came into his head. The American spirit took hold of him. He also became ambitious. In the long nights when there was little to do, Father had time to think. That was his undoing. He decided that he had in the past been an unsuccessful man because he had not been cheerful enough, and that in the future he would adopt a cheerful outlook on life. In the early morning he came upstairs and got into bed with Mother. She woke, and the two talked. From my bed in the corner, I listened. It was Father's idea that both he and Mother should try to entertain the people who came to eat at our restaurant. I cannot now remember his words, but he gave the impression of one about to become, in some obscure way, a kind of public entertainer. When people, particularly young people from the town of Bidwell, came into our place, as on very rare occasions they did, bright, entertaining conversation was to be made. From Father's words, I gathered that something of the jolly innkeeper effect was to be sought. Mother must have been doubtful from the first, but she said nothing discouraging. It was Father's notion that a passion for the company of himself and Mother would spring up in the breasts of the younger people of the town of Bidwell. In the evening, bright, happy groups would come singing down Turner's Pike. They would troop shouting with joy and laughter into our place. There would be song and festivity. I do not mean to give the impression that Father spoke so elaborately of the matter. He was, as I have said, an uncommunicative man. They want some place to go. I tell you that they want some place to go, he said over and over. That was as far as he got. My own imagination has filled in the blanks. For 2 or 3 weeks, this notion of Father's invaded our house. We did not talk much, but in our daily lives tried earnestly to make smiles take the place of glum looks. Mother smiled at the boarders, and I, catching the infection, smiled at our cat. Father became a little feverish in his anxiety to please. There was no doubt, lurking somewhere in him, a touch of the spirit of the showman. He did not waste much of his ammunition on the railroad men he served at night, but seemed to be waiting for a young man or woman from Bidwell to come in to show what he could do. On the counter in the restaurant, there was a wire basket kept always filled with eggs, and it must have been before his eyes when the idea of being entertaining was born in his brain. There was something prenatal about the way the eggs kept themselves connected with the development of his idea. At any rate, an egg ruined his new impulse in life. Late one night, I was awakened by a roar of anger coming from Father's throat. Both Mother and I sat upright in our beds. With trembling hands, she lighted a lamp that stood on the table by her head. Downstairs, the front door of our restaurant went shut with a bang, and in a few minutes Father tramped up the stairs. He held an egg in his hand, and his hand trembled as though he were having a chill. There was a half-insane light in his eyes. As he stood glaring at us, I was sure he intended throwing the egg at either Mother or me. Then he laid it gently on the table beside the lamp and dropped on his knees beside Mother's bed. He began to cry like a boy, and I, carried away